Wir nähern uns dem Ende des zweiten Tages.
And we're now coming to the end of the second day of, in total, 6 days. It's a unique possibility to gather generations, sections, scenes. We've seen that criticism has the form of theory of organization. Criticism can mean applied practice, developing perspectives without even being able to describe them. But it can also take the form of protest by putting one's own life at risk. When If I Lose went to Studio Bonn, you can still watch that on the website of Studio Bonn, together with Olga Krasnova and Olga Bresner. We found out about something that Putin's war has in common with populism in all countries: mobilization of ressentiment and fundamentalism against cultures of criticism that allow for a decentralization of power. And in the face of the running protests in Iran, it was important for us to put everything that we heard of in the last 2 days in relation with this struggle for freedom. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the painter, journalist, poet, Jina Khayyer, who since the 1990s wrote for the Süddeutsche Zeitung, Liberation, Zeitmagazin, Stern, Vogue, 032C. Khayyer has written portraits on Jenny Holzer, Edel Adnan, for example, Wolfgang Tillmans, amongst others. In 2015, she published her memoirs, Older Than Jesus, or My Life as a Woman. And 2021, she published her first poetry collection, Not Dark Yet, but It's Getting There, a book that you can actually turn into postcards. She lives in the Provence and in Paris, and she has a German passport and an Iranian passport. Jina, thank you very much for taking the next 30 minutes and for giving us a summary of the last 2 days. Thank you, Khayyer. Thank you for the invitation. The invitation to reflect on the conference is actually already an answer to the question of what the future of critique actually is. One word that was mentioned a lot in the last two days is multi-perspectivity. I was actually almost surprised to hear that many different voices here during the Congress. And I want to start with one that was almost silent, or that was silent, a crying man invited by the artist and feminist Casey Thornton. And why did that particularly touch me? Before Casey even told about what the performance was about, well, as Khayyer just said, my Iranian roots, of course, very much connect me with what is happening in Iran at the moment. And, well, I feel a mixture of anger and courage at the same time. And to actually see somebody cry here who comes from a culturally different context. He's a performance artist, Furu. He's Japanese. I think this is something that you can see. But the reason for his crying wasn't visible. And Casey's explanation was that she wanted to show vulnerability in the public sphere and the vulnerability within a society. And that is exactly what is being taken away from us. And what I thought was very poetic about that was that that's exactly what artists do. They present themselves vulnerable in the public sphere, and the future of critique was addressed from different perspectives, but I think in its core, the intention is to reflect on what the future of critique in the cultural industry will look like. And that includes everybody who works in culture: artists, writers, poets, musicians, directors, and so on. And we actually had representatives and voices from all those different fields. This vulnerability doesn't just apply to those who work in art, at least that's what I thought, or to those who observe the arts, but it also applies to critics, because the critic has to, if he wants to do his job properly, he needs to dare something. And in order to dare something, it takes courage. And as soon as you allow yourself to be courageous, to see something that others don't see, to accept voices that others don't except you dare something and you make yourself, you oppose yourself to others. And that might not be the same as being vulnerable, but we'll see if we have time to talk about that. Critics are facing a crisis. I started by writing the world is facing a crisis, but then during the last 2 days, I noticed that Germany is facing a crisis. Yesterday, for example, we heard a contribution of a journalist, a curator, Julia, and she described how in England, in Barbican, culture is something that is being dealt with very differently. As Khayyer said, I live in Paris, and there the way how we deal with culture in the public sphere and what's possible is also, once again, very different. So it might well be that I've been living in France for 10 years and that due to that reason, my perspective is quite different. And that is why I started by writing down world, and then I realized I had to replace it by saying Germany is being transformed, is facing a change. Very much so, especially when it comes to multi-perspectivity. That's something that Germany has to let happen. An art that, a type of art that doesn't reflect the zeitgeist, is that still art? If the answer to that question is no, why is then Anne Imhoff declared a contemporary artist? If the answer to that question is yes, doesn't that mean that critics also have to be contemporary? And due to the fact that I am here to reflect on the last 2 days, I would like to ask you to excuse me for finding the right notes. I, of course, had to add in certain comments. Contemporary. It means being a testimonial of the moment. What does that mean? A companion, somebody who accompanies us in this journey. I think this morning, if I remember correctly, Wilfried Weng was here, an architect, and he said something very interesting regarding the topic of architecture. And I thought, well, that really applies to everybody who works in culture. He said today in his field, in architecture, it is becoming easier for critics to point on those who are already popular rather than letting those who are not yet known shine. And that is a problem, of course, that takes place in every field of art. And why it is an important topic regarding the critic is that the one who shines the light is the critic. Also this morning, and it was a very important moment for me. Nikita Dhawan mentioned an important dilemma regarding a journey. If you embark on a journey, then you should at least be able to communicate in the language of the country that you visit. And if we once again think about multi-perspectivity, then one thing I noticed in these days was one thing that was mentioned again and again, that there's a certain lack of language. We're speechless. There's so much silence. And I was surprised to see that some are worried to name things. The crowd, for example, wasn't really explained. A crowd means people. It's an audience. We don't have to say crowd. In literature, you know what the crowd likes. It's shown in the number of the books that are sold. The cinema, you also know what the crowd likes, the people. But calling it a crowd dehumanizes it. And that's also a problem because we do culture in order to touch others. Just like yesterday, the crying man touched me emotionally. Yesterday, there was also a very interesting discussion about the digital sphere versus the analog sphere. Once again, if you think about worlds, spaces, one could think that the digital sphere is a world, a space, and so is the analog. So we are here in the analog world, and the digital world is in your pockets. And then a woman from the audience stood up and asked the panelists one thing. She was English. That is why, they have the neutral you. Where do you want to exist? That was the question. And it sounded like she was talking about aliens. Do you want to exist on this earth? And I thought, well, where else would we want to exist? But it's a very justified question if you think about the analog and the digital sphere. the world that we live in right now in this museum, another word that was mentioned multiple times is the gatekeeper. The gatekeeper who also presents a certain power, a censorship. But this also exists in the digital sphere. And I think that's even more dangerous because the digital restricts us, and Ann Cotton also mentioned that at the beginning of the last panel when she talked about bodies. The digital sphere forbids the female body to an extent that has an impact on how we communicate digitally. We are already starting to censor ourselves. We have subordinated ourselves. Visibility isn't a scarce resource, but what logic does it follow? This morning, I checked the Instagram channel of BBC and I saw an interview with Golshifteh Shafrani, an Iranian actress. I don't know who of you knows Golshifteh Shafrani. She's an Iranian actress who lives in France in exile. And she gave an interview to BBC regarding the situation in Iran and regarding what the situation was like for the people there. And I think it's good, but it made me sad because when in 79 the revolution broke out in Iran, in Germany, what happened was, well, what we still call the legacy media. For me, what we had was normal, you know, TV, radio, newspapers, and in that media, and I remember that well because it was my first, it was motivation to maybe become a journalist. And there was an expert for the Middle East who was called Peter Schollatur. And this Peter Schollatur really knew what he was talking about. He knew the language. He had visited the country. That doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything that he said about it, but he had a broad perspective on it. He had learned about it. And we had an interesting talk on decolonization. A curator was there and also an author. And for more than 20 years, she had worked with Russian art. And I would have loved to listen to her for weeks because you could really realize here that she knew what she was talking about. At the moment, German media is being very much criticized due to the fact that they really ignore the relevance of what was happening in Iran. There's very little reporting due to the lack of experts, and that was also another important topic here in the last days. The curator of the Bundeskunsthalle, in her first speech, actually emphasized that criticism is being eroded. We're lacking experts. And I thought with that term, erosion, Miss Krauss actually referred to a very powerful image, and where I asked myself whether we even have the time to think about the description of words, this image, to learn about new languages.
But this one mainstream medium in Germany decided to do something about the subject of Iran, that is a visual program. But it doesn't have to be necessarily new work. They said we will invite artists, and this is a good idea because who is actually driving the revolution? It's women, so we will take female artists. That was one criterion. And it doesn't necessarily have to be related to what is going on in Iran now. And the government is committing a genocide in its country, a genocide killing girls and boys, men, they are being violated, raped, sentenced to death. And one of the most influential German mainstream media decides to print a context-free series of pictures. And there was only one criterion, that is female artists from Iran. The pictures don't have to be up to date. They do not have to be related to the ongoing events. They do not have to live in Iran. They do not even have to be born in Iran. They just have to be women. And those who are responsible for this issue are not Iranian women, not a single Iran correspondent, no Middle East expert. And well, I would like to refer to what Khayyer said today. And before that, actually, I hadn't been fully aware of this when I hadn't heard her. That is, political problems are now being deflected to art. And to me, this was a new insight. And I might have suspected this, but I had never realized this properly. And although I knew the example, I couldn't put it in a context. And this, again, demonstrates to me why experts are so important. For the benefit of those who were not there, she put forward an example that is our federal chancellor. And I'm saying our federal chancellor because I was born in Germany, I grew up here, and I go to the elections here, and he's also my Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who on the one hand didn't go to Documente out of protest, but on the other hand, in Saudi Arabia, he actually shook many hands very generously. And this is a problem. And this problem, however, can be addressed and criticized only by people who feel the same about this. And there was no criticism about this from German mainstream media. When did they shake hands in Saudi Arabia? After, in Iran, the government had begun to imprison and murder its people. It wasn't that long ago, on the 22nd of September. And well, I will have a closer look at what Mrs. Dawan said, because if politicians deflect the responsibility more and more to the art sphere, and I'm anyway convinced that art is one of the most political acts because it's the personal aspect, what you present, what you write about, what you talk about, and this again brings me to the vulnerability of the crying man, then criticism has an even bigger responsibility than we suspected before. Then the duty of criticism, of critique, is really to put things into context, into a perspective with experience, not only to visit an exhibition and say, this was good, why, in the art context, because we also had a panel about colonization. We again heard this, and many who may have given it some thought may know that our assumptions about references are not true. There was the director of the theater in Dortmund. I hope that my notes are correct. And she's an Afro-European German woman, and she said that she learned at the late stage that with a high degree of probability Alessandro Dumas was a black person wearing a white mask. And as far as I'm concerned, I grew up not that far from here in Wiesbaden. And my first access to, I would say, to poetry, if you like, was music. That is the lyrics. And even as a young girl, a teenager, I was surprised that I felt so much addressed by black artists, female artists, Joan McBride, or Nina Simone, Lauryn Hill, and I couldn't explain why this interested me so much until a short while ago, because of the revolution in Iran. A protest song was again broadcasted. Young artist composed a song on the basis of tweets. And he also sang this in Farsi, and I speak the language, and this really touched me, and only then did I understand why I identified myself with this, because I didn't have any role models to identify with, and interestingly enough, the only ones I had were black women, which made me think, but it also showed me that these may have been the first ones who started a sort of revolution, and we've just had this very interesting discussion. And it was very good that we made a distinction between what is a protest and what is not. And this bus scene, that is this gesture of protest, is what we are now witnessing on a daily basis. And people are staying silent very loudly about this. Now, as to language, this is my art form where I like best working in. And today I found a young music critic very interesting, who also gave an answer to the question about the future of critique, and that's true. Her name is Leonie Reinecke, and she stated that she was trying to find new language for the new music which she reviews in her program. She needs a new vocabulary, and I like this because it showed this sincerity which she has in her work, and that she is fully aware of her responsibility. In the discussion which Anne just conducted, the term desire was used, and I certainly see this more romantically than Eva Ilius, and I believe that a desire is an important precondition for creating something. And of course, I expect a critic who is supposed to enter into a dialogue with those producing art and culture. And this is one of the duties, that is, there should also be a desire emerging there. And yeah, this really touched me. And she said something else interesting about the vocabulary. And many things were mentioned here which made me think and which I hadn't been aware of before. The listening biography, and I just talked about lyrics of songs which made me interested in poetry. So I also have a certain listening biography, but this is a new expression. And she said that she had to find a new vocabulary, and she has found a new language that is a viewing or watching biography, a linguistic biography, and we might need space for this. And we also talked a lot about the economy and money funding, and that's an important investment. That is investing in these spaces which comprise this diversity. This has become very clear here. And it was really presented in a great way, but it was well presented, well organized, and brilliantly curated. This is why I started here. That is, we invited people who say something and they're making themselves again attackable and vulnerable, because you have to say here what you think, even in public. And this is curated in such an excellent manner that I'm placing great hopes on the future. Eric Clark said something, and it may be that this touched a nerve in me, this panel, because there were such different voices, but it was in a way about the same context. And he said something about the subtext, the cultural quotations, which is another important point when we give it some thought. That we are in a dialogue with contemporaries, and this may be my criticism of criticism, the question of whether we are really dealing with contemporary critics who are reviewing contemporary art. Because quite often, for instance, people talk about electronic music, although they have never gone to a club. This is a problem. You cannot just listen to this type of music at home, and at least once you must make the full experience, the complete experience, so much so, perhaps that you haven't gone home for 2 days, otherwise you will not understand what this music may express. And classic music amateurs will certainly argue that you cannot write or review an opera if you have never been to an opera. Eric Clark said that the subtext is important, the cultural quotes, which only locals will know, or experts, those who have studied languages and cultures. I don't remember whether he said this or why I added this, because, well, it made me think, as I said, no academic studies, but what you have experienced yourself on the ground, this is very important. when you think about what the future of criticism might be like, in particular in the context of so much is being analyzed in digital and analog terms. But we are people with our own bodies in a physical space. And of course, an expert is someone who has also experienced this, in particular as far as diversity is concerned. And then it's important that when Germany is undergoing change, and if we want to permit diversity, we must also provide space to this. Respect and value have often been mentioned, and in general, value is something very important, not in capitalistic terms or monetary terms, but what is it worth of being told, of being related. And an artist will ask this question, and the most important critic is those who produce culture themselves, because they select what they will deal with. For instance, when I start to write a new novel, it may well be that then I may deal with it for 5 or even 10 years. Filmmakers, film producers, I mean, you must have stamina. These are long projects and it's an investment. And so it must be worth a lot to myself. And at the same time, that's another term which was often used, synchronicity, simultaneity. This is, of course, the other aspect. Critics, curators, those who appreciate the valuation. And I think it also was the architect this morning. No, it wasn't the architect. It was Helmut Draxler who used the word respect as the only one. I was quite surprised by this because he was the only one to use this word. The respect which we must show to those who produce culture. And the point is not so much to criticize, but then to defend. And there is a brilliant podcast. It's called Death of an Artist. And you might think that it's a metaphor, but it's really about the death of an artist. It was made by a curator, an American female curator called Helen Noseworth. I don't know whether you are familiar with her. She is a very influential curator in America, the curator in chief at the Museum of Modern Art in Los Angeles, and she's known for permitting and including diversity in the culture industry. You will see that it's not only a German but also an American problem. She criticized the institution, the museum, as the curator-in-chief. She said, you must open the gates, I've got the key, and I will open the doors. And she was immediately fired. It was a big scandal. So critic must also be able to put up with critique. And in response to this, she produced this podcast. And yeah, listen to it, it's really great. And now this brings me to the end. That is, who speaks? And I would like to again thank you for the invitation. It's always important to know who you give the microphone to, who speaks with whom, and who speaks about whom. The sincere answer to these questions will prepare the path for the future of the hopefully contemporary critique. Thank you very much indeed.